Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we gathered on and pay my respects to the elders past and present. This land always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. This is my first time at MardiGrass, and it is a real pleasure to be here to be speaking with you on something I'm very passionate about, that is drug law reform. My name is Mehreen Faruqi. I'm a Greens MP in New South Wales Parliament, and amongst my many portfolios, I also proudly have the responsibility of the drugs and harm minimization portfolio for the Greens. And I do apologize for rushing in and rushing out at this MardiGrass. I just had to speak at an event, a gender equality conference this morning in Sydney, and I have to head back tomorrow for some other events and rallies. And I'm particularly sorry that I'll miss participating in the panel discussion on politics tomorrow, but I do know that my colleague David Shoebridge has kindly stepped in for that. So, so while my talk today is about cannabis law reform and the experiences that I had just recently in Oregon and California, I do want to just take you back a little bit in history, because it's quite important to remember how we ended up with such terrible and harmful drug laws, so that we are able to then look at that historically and find out ways of how we can change these laws. So just recently, an interview published in Harper's Magazine, 22 years after the interview was actually held, showed the real intentions behind prohibitionist drug policies in the United States and the laws that resulted from that. Richard Nixon's domestic policy chief in the late 1960s told Harper's Bazaar this, and I quote, "The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the Vietnam War or blacks. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did," end quote. So from the very beginning, the drug war has been about the criminalization of groups in society that were perceived and still are perceived to be threatening or otherwise undesirable. So the history of the drug war really tells you that the criminalization and the use of certain drugs has never been about the harm that those drugs might cause people, or about helping people, or even about being grounded in health, science, compassion, justice, or any human rights. It's always been about creating a narrative to suit particular politicians and their ideologies. And let's make no mistake, the same thing is panning out and has panned out in Australia as well. We have incredibly prohibitionist anti-drug laws. According to the New South Wales crime statistics, in the 12 months leading up to September last year, there were more than 25,000 recorded incidents of people being charged or detected for possession or use of cannabis. And I think Will pointed out there were many more thousands criminalized for the use of other drugs. Having a criminal record for smoking a joint, or indeed any other drug, helps no one at all. This is something that can and must change. And of course, the use of cannabis, because that's what I'm going to focus on today, is a classic example of how this needs to change. And thankfully, international jurisdictions are starting to turn the tide on this particular issue. Over the past 5 years, we have seen numerous American states move to legalize and regulate the sale and supply of adult recreational cannabis on the grounds that prohibition has dismally failed. Since 2012, pot has been legalized in Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, as well as the District of Columbia. And the sky has clearly not fallen in on any of these states or any of these cities. And I was fortunate enough earlier this year to actually go to Oregon and California. It was really a visit to meet some of my family there, but I did take the opportunity to talk to and have a number of conversations with advocates, experts, and activists about how this transformation has come about in the US. I did also visit a number of growing facilities, testing labs, as well as dispensaries. And in Portland, I came across many dispensaries with the green cross outside them, and met a number of people working there, including people who they call bud tenders, who really are experts in their own right. They advise people further about the prescriptions their doctors have given them on cannabis use, doses, strengths, what type of cannabis to use, what variety of cannabis to use. And in Oregon, of course, it's the same dispensaries that are selling cannabis for medical use and selling them for non-medical use as well. And I have to say, some of them look more like hipster cafes that you see in Sydney than any dispensary you'd come across. I think in the US, though, in particular in Oregon and California and states like that, the long-standing availability of cannabis for medical purposes in these states has had a profound effect on the maturity of the conversation around drugs more generally. And it is heartening to see governments around Australia now actually start talking about medical cannabis, and taking similar steps, though probably I would argue that they're very small steps at the moment in terms of legalizing cannabis. This treatment is so important to people who need it, people for whom in many cases there is no other treatment which has actually worked. And of course, it can facilitate a more nuanced and rational discussion also about generally drugs in society and how to deal with it. But it is also important to note that there are major differences between what is and isn't acceptable as medical marijuana. And it differs in the states as well. In California, for instance, it includes ailments such as arthritis, chronic pain, migraine, and severe nausea. And this does allow the patient, it gives the patient the choice actually to use cannabis over much more dangerous but so-called legal drugs such as pain medications and opiates. And it is unfortunate, I have to say, that the intention here in New South Wales is to have a rather narrow set of allowable conditions for medical marijuana. But I think it's at least a start. We can start there and get to a place where other people are, hopefully soon. But through my time in the US and talking to all these various people, it became crystal clear to me that having open discussions on drugs really helps remove the stigma that we have in society, where we still talk about it in very hushed tones and behind closed doors. These changes have really brought the drugs and discussions about drugs from the shadows of an underground market into the light of legalization. But most importantly, the thing I realized was that there were so many factors, and I'll talk to you about them in a minute, that came together to spur this change. And amongst them was different people from the community coming together, and they include mothers of children who might be using drugs, parents, of course. It includes religious leaders as well. It includes civil liberties organizations. It includes organizations who are involved in racial issues. And the media, of course, has been key to this, as well as ex-police officers, I was told, because current police officers are not very willing to talk about it, but ex-police officers are. And no doubt, of course, when I was speaking to people, there are still challenges, even in states that have decriminalized and legalized, and regulated the sale and supply of cannabis. There are issues. One particular one that I came across was on banking. So obviously, because cannabis is not yet legal in federal law in America, much of the trade and banks come under federal law. Much of the trade in cannabis happens in cash. So one of my uncles in Portland works in an electricity company, and they have actually built a secure room for people who grow cannabis, which use a lot of electricity to pay their bills by cash. So everyone is adapting to this change because they do think that it is the right thing to do, it is the just thing to do, it is the only way forward. And of course, the question of edibles is also a vexed one, where food safety concerns and the potency will have to be carefully considered, and that's a debate they're having at the moment. We also need to consider, of course, how commercialized we allow this to become. After all, do we really want a repeat of the power of the alcohol industry and companies that is rampant in Australia at the moment? So these are issues that the US jurisdictions are grappling with, and they are overcoming it step by step. But what is also really interesting to note in the US around this movement on drug law reform is that it has been driven by popular movements by the people, by different states having referendums. They are not reforms that have been particularly championed by politicians, but reforms that have been pushed by ordinary people. And one such person that I did meet in Portland was Leah Morer. Leah and her husband Travis have been at the forefront of activism and have been advocating for some years on cannabis law reform in Oregon, especially since they experienced quite a paramilitary-style home invasion for growing cannabis when they used to live in Colombia in 2009. And I must say, across the board, whether it was Leah or whether it was anyone else involved in the cannabis legalization or the selling of it or the growing of it, I was really impressed and touched by the passion that they had, not because they could set up an industry or because they could make money, but the passion that they had about the justice and the human rights issue about it. And so the discussions around how it all came about, what were the factors that brought it all together. Some of them were, of course, around the argument that all users are not abusers. Others were around the argument that people can use restricted products in a non-harmful way as well, of course. But the key ones that did persuade the community, and of course in the end some of the politicians as well, were related to safety and fiscal issues. So around safety, they made a big argument about the safety of younger people and of children, and that the harms of criminalizing children or young people are much, much greater than any harm that cannabis or probably any other drug could cause, because it ejects them from schools, locking them up behind bars is a lifetime effect that is very pervasive when you just kind of criminalize people for having possession or use of drugs in a small quantity. The safety of supply as well and sale was a big issue, that big argument that they used. So, when you have it legalized and regulated, sale of it, then you can have it tested. It's not adulterated. It's sold in retail outlets, not in dark alleys or in parks and streets. And of course, the other big argument around the economy, the fiscal argument, was about law enforcement and the money and the resources that are spent on law enforcement at the moment for very non-violent, low-level drug offenders. And that money could actually be redirected to real issues if they want that. And of course, the argument of the sales tax income, which I think in Colorado is used mainly on education programs in schools. So this has been a people's campaign through and through, and the people are winning, and I think that's the biggest lesson that we can learn from that. While the politicians, I think always are way behind public opinion, it's been the same case in the US. And it has really shown a clear divide between ordinary people, what ordinary people want, and what politicians might be willing to legislate. And of course, like I said, there have been roadblocks at every level, but people have overcome them. And the upcoming, I think it's the November vote to legalize cannabis in California, of course, everyone considered it to be a potential game changer for the US anyway, because it could trigger a nationwide change, because California, with its 40 million people, and position as a global center for entertainment, for commerce, and culture, would be the biggest and the most significant jurisdiction so far to legalize it. All the best of luck to them, and we will be looking at them closely, watching what happens there. Because it does matter what happens across the world. It does matter to us in Australia what happens across the world. We do have a war on drugs in Australia, in part because it has been historically influenced by whatever changes have happened internationally. So once the rest of the world, and we know that they are changing, of course, we will change as well with them. The United Nations Special Session on Drugs wrapped up several weeks ago. The UN formally, unfortunately, continues to pursue and prioritize a failed prohibition approach, imagining a drug-free world, which they believe is possible. Of course, for the rest of us who do have our heads screwed on in the right direction, think that that is not an achievable aim, neither should it be. In an open letter to the UN, I joined with over 1,000 other politicians, doctors, lawyers, and drug law reform advocates, including Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Jesse Jackson, and many others, to implore the UN to strike a new path And I'll just read a bit of the section of the letter that we signed up to the UN. And this is what it says. The drug control regime that emerged during the last century has proven disastrous for global health, security, and human rights, focused overwhelmingly on criminalization and punishment. It created a vast illicit market that has enriched criminal organizations, corrupted governments, triggered explosive violence, distorted economic markets, and undermined basic moral value. A growing number of city, state, and national governments no longer treat drug use and possession as crimes. Some are beginning to legally regulate cannabis for medical and even non-medical purposes. Many more recognize the need to make essential medicines readily available, especially for pain and palliative care in lower income countries. But far greater and more systemic reforms are essential. And one way of going about doing this is, of course, through drug law reform, and particularly cannabis law reform, by legalizing and regulating the supply and sale of cannabis to adults across the country. Governments do know that prohibition has failed, and more progressive members of political parties are starting to stand up and say, hey, I don't think I can be quiet anymore. You can see this at the federal level where there has been a cross-party drug law reform group formed. And dare I say that even members of the law enforcement community know the same thing. And I met with such a member in Portland. Actually, it was a very chance meeting. I had lost my way and was desperate for some caffeine. So I saw this woman standing at the corner of a building, and I asked her if there was a cafe nearby, and she said, oh yeah, the best cafe in Portland is just 50 meters away. And then she said to me, but hang on a minute, I'll bring you something that goes really well with coffee. So I waited there, and she went in, came out. She came out with a nicely packed packet of cannabis cookies. She didn't know why I was there, what I was doing. It was a completely chance meeting. Then we started talking, and she was actually an ex-policewoman who had left the police force because of seeing the disastrous impacts of the drug policies that were there at that time. And she had actually opened up a bakery, cannabis bakery. So she'd give me a tour of the bakery. I met all her staff. And again, another really passionate woman advocating for change. But I guess we also have to realize that with the current New South Wales government, however, we do live in the age of stoner sloth. And we do have to, that's a battle we have to have as well. We have to overcome these, kind of cringe-inducing political own goals that they have. We all know that this really baffling and quite farcical campaign, which set the New South Wales government a cool $350,000, is a typical example of how the government deals with this issue. The campaign was based on an infantile and childish approach to cannabis that was ripe for mockery. That's exactly what happened across the world. It had no educational value, and rather than educating people about the issues associated with maybe smoking cannabis, it talked down to people. And we know that when we want to influence or initiate change, the only way it happens is talking with people, not talking at people. And Jeff Sparrow perhaps put it best when he said that this particular campaign was a symptom of our inept drugs debate. Just in the last few weeks, we've also seen reports from Queensland, from the Queensland government, which again inexplicably pushed to reclassify cannabis to be considered as dangerous as heroin, when really, as Will said, we should actually be looking to decriminalizing all drugs. It's sometimes really hard to understand who these people are really and what their agenda is. I mean, any drug and alcohol professional would be able to tell you that the harm caused by cannabis, for instance, is much lower than harm that can be caused by alcohol or even tobacco. But unfortunately, opportunistic politicians are willing to put facts aside and really push their own political own goals, in fact. So our challenge is to stand up to this nonsense and be louder and bolder in our calls for cannabis law reform. And I can certainly commit to that today in front of you. We live in a country where 1 in 3 adults has reported to have used cannabis in their lifetime. And around, I think it's 750,000 people use the drug every week. They should not be criminalized. Rather, If needed, they should be properly and sensibly educated about any risks and issues associated with the long-term use of the drug, like we do with alcohol and tobacco. This is not a radical call anymore at all. We must legislate for this sensible policy. We must have this reform for health and human rights. Ultimately, though, with most of the issues that we deal with, strong voices will have to come from both inside and outside Parliament in order to keep the pressure on. All of us must take the risk of being brave, coming together, and working within our parties and communities to achieve the reforms that are so desperately needed. So my hope for 2016 is that it be a year where we rise above party politics and make decisions based on evidence and for the health and well-being of the people who we represent. I do believe that this is achievable. I am optimistic, and I look forward to working with you to make this happen. Thank you once again for having me here today.
Thank you, Mehreen. That's very, very inspiring and interesting. So it's great that the Greens are on our side as well. Are there any questions in the audience?
Can I just confirm that you said that the recent conference, was it last weekend, the United Nations conference, that they've gone ahead with more prohibition?
I think they haven't changed their aim of making the world drug-free, is my understanding.
That's sad, isn't it?
Any other comments or questions? Yep.
If the UN did intend on trying to make a drug-free world, as they say, would that also include all pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, well, that's, I take it as a rhetorical question. That's a really good point.